So the next video in my series of 3, criticizing atheism, Christianity, and Islam, will be one criticizing Islam. Now, why did I decide to do this video second and not first? Well, I feel that if I made this video first, or not as part of a series, there's a greater chance that this video would have been taken down by YouTube than the videos criticizing Christianity or atheism. So there's a couple main problems with Islam and with Muslims present day, and this is mainly due to an overall lack of understanding of Islam. And this isn't limited to the Western world lacking information on Islam, but a lot of people who call themselves Muslim have little understanding of Islam as well. Islam is considered to be the fastest growing religion, but this is actually not true. What's really happened is a form of cultural belief and development has grown out of the Middle East and stolen the name of Islam and used the religion as a hat to justify its behavior, leeching off of pure Islam like a parasite. So in my opinion, a lot of people who claim to be Muslims and think themselves to be Muslims and act in a manner that they think is Muslim are actually not Muslims. It's like a dog who would like to be a duck and tries to quack like one, but is still not a duck. Now, how do I come to this conclusion? Well, the topic that most people will be familiar with is terrorism, 9/11 terrorist attacks, suicide bombers, so on and so forth, so we will use them as the first exhibit. So first and foremost, Osama bin Laden is commonly perceived to have been an individual that declared jihad on the West. And many people who call themselves Muslim follow this and blow themselves to bits in suicide attacks. But the thing is, Osama bin Laden had no authority in the religion of Islam to declare a jihad. Furthermore, Islam doesn't condone suicide. Many suicide bombers are either illiterate or simply do not read the Quran with any sort of consistency. We have the same problem that the Catholic Church had in the Crusades, that being that many people relied on a person to be a spiritual leader to direct their actions instead of their own biblical readings. And this created lots of extortion and exploitation of the believing public. This is the same for Islam. If everyone who was thinking about becoming a suicide bomber suddenly picked up the Quran and started reading it, not so many would want to go kill themselves. Now, counterpoint to this is that perfectly literate and educated individuals sometimes become suicide bombers, including middle-class people from the West. But here's the thing. We think too much of our Western educational system. Critical thinking skills, those being the skills that would stop someone from becoming a suicide bomber, are pretty much entirely left out of our educational criteria. So we educate people with information that isn't relevant to the topic and therefore is useless. So how do I perceive the situation as it is now? Well, when we look at the world in terms of Islamic nations, with Islamic governments, and Islamic behavior and customs, you may as well consider Islamic nations to be extinct. None of the currently existing Islamic nations that I am aware of, or have done research on, legitimately follow the religion of Islam. They follow the modern culture of Islam, which uses religion as a mask. So how can I, a Westerner with an obvious American accent, criticize Islam in such a manner, despite not living in any Arab nation? Well, I can do it by looking at history and looking at the Quran. A common argument used to bash Islam is that the idea of peaceful Muslims is a lie, constructed by people who are being faced with the reality of a developing world where their archaic behavior is no longer valid, so their religion must be modified to adjust to the new times. This is often used as a point to attempt to prove that Islam is a lie, but this rationalization in itself is a lie because it's largely ignorant of history. When the Islamic Empire was at its height, when its civilization shined the brightest, the Middle East was the world's center of medical development, development in literature, development in technology, translation of books and texts, higher learning, etc. Now I'm going to tell you about a guy named Saladin. He's arguably the second most important person in the Muslim world, the first being the Prophet Muhammad. Saladin is the military leader of Islam, basically, and most of the so-called jihadists against Jews and against the West are doing things in his name. But here's the thing. In order to be a terrorist or a suicide bomber, you have to violate Saladin's war doctrines and policies on a consistent basis. He had strict rules to avoid ever targeting and killing civilians and would not allow suicide attacks. He had rules set in place that were to be strictly followed, that even when Islam held control of Jerusalem, Jews and Christians had to be allowed to do their pilgrimages to the city and not be persecuted. This, in combination with the fact that Islam doesn't condone suicide tactics, means that in order to become a suicide bomber, you cannot be a Muslim. You can think that you're a Muslim, you can pretend you're a Muslim, and you can have other people tell you that you're a Muslim, but according to one of the most important people in the Islamic world and Islamic history, you are not a Muslim. Sometimes people who call themselves peaceful Muslims use the argument that suicide bombers and violent Muslims are not actually Muslims, and this is the reason why. Terrorists, both direct terrorism and cultural terrorism, violate Islamic war policy on a consistent basis. They have to violate it on a consistent basis, otherwise they wouldn't be able to use their current suicide bombing and civilian targeting tactics. Islam as we know it today in the media can't be compared to legitimate Islam back when the Islamic Empire was at the peak of its existence. It bears nothing in resemblance. Back when Islam was at its most powerful, they were the center for medical and technological development, and had laws that people pursuing knowledge, including Christians and Jews, should not be persecuted. They had war policies that strictly forbid targeting unarmed civilians. None of these things are reflected by what passes for Islam nowadays. You ever play the Fallout video games? You know how in those games bottle caps are used as currency instead of real money? Same idea. It's not really a currency, it's just passing for a currency. So none of the Islamic nations that I am aware of actually follow the Islamic nation model. They claim to, but by any actual existing definition from history, they don't. Because of this, I can say that Islamic nations don't exist. What passes for an Islamic nation is a cheap imitation and nothing more. Present-day Muslim nations often stand in sharp contrast to the powerful Islamic states of the past. So how did this happen? Why does it happen? Well, the same reason the Catholic Church came up with the tithe donation slogan. As soon as a coin in the coffer rings, a soul from purgatory springs. The ruling class used the religion as a tool to manipulate and exploit the people who think that they follow the faith. This is why nowadays the Middle East is in the gutter in terms of medical development, technological development, higher learning, education, and translation of text. The Middle East has to be kept that way, because if suddenly everyone who thought themselves to be a Muslim suddenly realized that they couldn't depend on a religious leader and should read the Quran for themselves, then the people currently having power would lose most of their power. It's the same thing that happened to the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages. It's just been rebranded. The fact of the universe is that an ignorant populace that can be conformed into a belief is significantly easier to control and manipulate and exploit. At this point, religion becomes a tool, and if it were not Islam, it would be something else. Now that we've established historical causes, let's further criticize how the ignorant prats who misrepresent Islam in the West behave nowadays. Now there was a situation in France not too long ago about the banning of the burqa, and the reason given was to allegedly help women adjust to life in the West. This resulted in lots of women simply refusing to go outdoors and a large amount of Muslim mob violence. In fact, very commonly in Europe nowadays, whenever someone does a peaceful criticism of Islam, the typical response that we see in the media are threats of violence, vandalism, and the occasional murder. Now here's the thing, I don't think a form of dress should be banned for simply being a form of dress. That said, we should not be tolerant of intolerance, and many people calling themselves Muslims behave in a very intolerant manner, and as such they need to be removed from society. But we ourselves are being unreasonably intolerant by banning clothing articles simply for being clothing articles that deviate from the norm. So I think France had the wrong reason for banning the burqa. There was a right reason, example being we frequently have people who attempt to get through airport security wearing burqas or other very covering outfits and keep demanding the right to get onto planes without being searched or removing the burqa because, as they claim, they are Muslim and are entitled to their coverings and don't have to conform to security checks. That is ridiculous, because at this point the clothing articles become a public safety concern. You have to be insane to think that certain people based on religion should be allowed through airport security without searches, and I frequently hear this argument from people who call themselves Muslim. That idea is ridiculous, not only because it presents a public safety concern, but because the Quran doesn't support it, and Islam doesn't support it. The present-day existing culture that calls itself Islam, the cheap imitation, supports it, but not the religion. So let's talk about the burqa. Some so-called Muslim nations, like Saudi Arabia, enforce moral codes as a form of legal doctrine, and this is done in the name of what is called Sharia law. But according to my research, Sharia law was basically designed to be a constitution of general activity. It was never meant to be imposed as state law or applied onto non-believers. Dress code is one of the things frequently enforced, and in the West we believe that Islam mistreats women by forcing them to dress a certain way. Most Muslim women that I talk to fall into one specific logical fallacy. When I ask why someone wears a burqa, they give me one of two responses. It's usually, I don't want to be disrespected for showing skin, or, as a Muslim woman, I must cover myself with a burqa. But no one can ever tell me where in the Quran it says to wear a burqa. Do you know why you can't find it in the Quran? Because the burqa was not invented until hundreds of years later, according to people that I have talked to from Afghanistan. If you think that the Quran had a rule in it to enforce everyone conforming to a dress code for a piece of clothing that didn't come into existence until centuries later, you are an idiot. Now, let's actually read a couple passages from the Quran on the subject of clothing and covering, shall we? And I grabbed this off Wikipedia, so do tell me if the verbatim's wrong. Surah 24, 30-31. And say to the believing women that they should lower their gaze and guard their modesty, that they should not display their beauty or ornaments except what must ordinarily appear thereof, that they should draw their khimar, I might be pronouncing that wrong. Anyway, it goes on to list a number of different persons, and at the end we get to this point, or small children who have no sense of the shame of sex, and that they should not strike their feet in order to draw attention to their hidden ornaments. Now here's a clip from Surah 33. Enjoy your wives, your daughters, and the wives of true believers, that they should cast their outer garments over their persons when abroad. That is most convenient, that they may be distinguished and not be harassed. Now, what do these lines of text mean? Well, the burqa and the idea of full-body covering wasn't invented until centuries later, and there's nothing saying that the burqa must be worn, so obviously this can't refer to a burqa. It's fairly obvious to me that this refers to basic clothing and not dressing overly provocatively. I'm taking special note about the "what must ordinarily appear" bit. I think that the idea the text is trying to get across is not a specific instruction to fully cover yourself, it's just to have some degree of modesty that is adjusted to be appropriate for the culture and area you're living in. I think the rule, when you step back and look at it with some objectivity, means don't go to a bar and take your top off and dance on a table just because you know you're hot. And while I may disagree with the idea of encouraging women not to do that, it's nowhere near the claim that they need to wear a burqa all the time. The burqa wasn't used when the Islamic Empire was at the height of its power. Don't lie to yourself and think that Muslims 1,000 years ago lived with these same exact rules. You're delusional if you believe that. Now on to the next bit. It says specifically, "that is most convenient, that they may be distinguished and not be harassed." And this line immediately comes after a line about Muslims being given unfair discrimination and treatment. Now, based on this, I have to conclude that it means something along the lines of don't have the women dress provocatively when non-believers will harass and possibly assault women simply for being attractive. This is a basic convenience and security rule, and nowadays in so-called civilized society, this would no longer be a rule worth following. It says right there in the text that the rule is specifically for convenience in certain situations. As a reader, it's fairly obvious to me that the meaning of these passages is nowhere near the claim that women must wear burqas wherever they go. In fact, it's the opposite, so don't claim that the Quran or Islam dictates this dress code. That logic is fallacious, and as of yet, I've never been presented with a passage from the Quran to contradict my rationalization here. Now on to the second criticism of the burqa and so-called Muslims who encourage it. Remember a little bit ago about how I was talking about the two main reasons I hear from Muslim women? One of them was, I don't want to be disrespected for showing skin. Yeah, I have something to say about that. If you are wearing a burqa for the singular reason that you don't want to be disrespected for not wearing it, you are not a good Muslim woman. Most say to me, because I cover myself, I am good Muslim woman. No, that's not true. You are altering the way you dress on a consistent basis in the society that you live in just because you don't want disrespect for dressing a little bit differently. You're really that concerned with what people think about you that you are not willing to stand up for what you want, what your beliefs are, and how you feel. If you're wearing a burqa for the singular reason that you don't want to be disrespected for not wearing one, you are not a good Muslim woman. You're a coward. There are people throughout history who have had to fight and die to protect their beliefs, Islam being among those beliefs, and you're going to alter the way you dress, part of the way you live your life, for the singular reason that you're afraid of what some people will think about you, what they'll think if you share your beliefs, if you have an opinion that's a little bit different from the norm. How does that make you a good Muslim? As a Muslim, aren't you supposed to share your beliefs with others? Now, if you're wearing a burqa for protection from the hot sun so you don't get burns or skin cancer risk because you work outside or some other reason, more power to you. But if you dress in this manner for the singular reason that you're afraid of what people will think if you don't, you are not a good Muslim woman, you are a coward. Don't lie to yourself and attempt to deny your own reality by claiming that you're dressing in accordance with Islamic law. You're not. You're shying away from telling people what you think and what you feel and encouraging something as childish as judging people based on the way they dress. This is an archaic, primitive system of judging others that the Quran does not condone. Other people fight and die to protect your rights, your own rights to be a Muslim being part of those rights. And you can't even stand up for your beliefs as a Muslim? No, you'd rather just push it to the back of your mind and think, I will wear my burqa for now, maybe later I will read up on it in the Quran and figure out what I should do. After all, the people who are encouraging you to wear a burqa claim to be Muslim. They must be right. It's not urgent for you to do something about it. They are also Muslims after all. But we all know the day of reading will never come. You'll just push that sinking feeling that you're doing something wrong into the back of your mind again and again, and wear that burqa every day until the day you die. Because you're too much of a coward to actually stand up for real Muslim beliefs and values, and I have no respect for you. You belong in a submissive position, obedient to your husband, not because you are a woman, but because you are a coward. You are just using I am good Muslim woman as an excuse to sit back and take the easy path, while real Muslims actually stand up for what they believe in. And don't think for a moment that just because you're wearing a burqa, you're standing up for Islam. If you're doing it because you're afraid of what people will think of you if you don't, then you are conforming to the norm, not standing up for anything. So video recap in short. No currently existing nations that claim to be Islamic that I am aware of actually have a basis off of the Quran or the model Islamic empire in history, or the main military leader of the Muslim world. If Saladin came back tomorrow and looked at the Middle East, he would weep. The reason the Middle East and modern Islam is in such a damaged and corrupt state is because of the exact same reasons it happened to the Catholic Church during the Middle Ages. The religion is used as a tool to manipulate people. A terrorist, suicide bomber, or someone who sanctions either of these cannot be considered a Muslim by the standards of the Islamic Empire when it was at its peak. This is not a matter of opinion, this is a fact, and facts are not up for democratization. Current Islamic culture very often is based off of Islam in the name only and deviates from it significantly. Everyday issues like the wearing of the burqa or demanding special treatment at airports are everyday examples of the culture itself being corrupt. See you next time, YouTube.